Hello, everyone. This week's Parsha is Parsha Tetzaveh, in which, as we had mentioned last week in Parsha Shurma, there is a fundamental debate between the Parshanim, Rashi and Ramban. Ramban reads the Parsha Shurma Tetzaveh, Kitisa Yaakov Pekude, all as one continuation, chronological order, in that the Parshot are occurring in the chronological order in which they're listed, meaning that there is no break, everything is a straight order. You go from Shurma Tetzaveh, the commandment to build a Mishkan, immediately followed by Kitisa, where the Chet HaEgel occurs at the beginning of the Parsha, followed by V'yakom and Bikude. Now, however, we saw last week Rashi, in his commentary to Parsha Kitisa, suggests otherwise. Rashi suggests, we're going to focus on Rashi's interpretation as we said we would last week. Rashi suggests, Ein muktam u'uchar b'Torah. Reading from the bottom over here in Pasuk Yud Maaseh ha'egel kodem letzivui malechet hamishkan yamim mirabim haya. The commandment to build the Mishkan followed the Chet HaEgel. Chet HaEgel occurred previous to the building of the actual Mishkan and before the commandment to build the Mishkan. Sher b'Shavas, Sher b'Tammuz, Nishta b'Ruhalochut, Luchot, B'Yom Kippurim, Nitratza Kodesh Baruch Hu Yisrael, Maharat Tchilu ben Davat min Nidvat HaMishkan, V'Hukam b'Echad b'Nisan. Rashi opines that the building of the Mishkan, the gathering of the contributions for the Mishkan, and the commandment to actually build the Mishkan, most importantly, occurred after the Chet HaEgel. Rashi tries to prove this through the amount of days that could have transpired and how it has to make sense in this order. Rashi and thus famously quotes, there's no chronological order in Torah. Now, in theory, we have to understand this idea. What does it mean, Torah? Torah is listed in a certain order. We have a Masorah. These are the way the Parsha are listed out, the way all the Sofrim write the Sifrei Torah. Now, in order to understand this, let's take a look at the Chizkuni. Now, this idea I'm developing, going along with the way Rav Menachem Leibtag of Yeshivat Har Tzion in the Gush develops this in his website on a article on the website OU Torah, and I'm going to repeat some of his suggestions. And he says to take a look at the Chizkuni over here, where the Chizkuni describes what exactly it means when you have psukim that are out of order. And the Chizkuni writes over here in Pasuk Lamabet, Kol mitzvot shnamru be-mem yom rishonim ube-mem yom achronim v'chol mitzvot shnistavu Yisrael nemru minisan shebo Yisrael shav Yisrael mitzrayim ad shebo Yisrael mitzrayim ad esrim be'ir b'shnat hashenit aval Torah megillah nitna shelafi shaya Moshe shomea mitzvot mipi HaKadosh Baruch Hu ha'kotiv kol acha v'acha be'megillah tala'atzma. This is the important part. The Chizkuni opines that Moshe Rabbeinu received each mitzvah and commanded them to Bnei Yisrael, as we read in the Parshiyot. The Moshe Rabbeinu wrote down each mitzvah in a separate sort of sefer, in his own scroll. And then at the end of the 40 years, Chizkuni writes, so Kushabali Fater Min Olam, Sidr Sefer Torah, V'kiva Boa Parshiot, Ad Hayom Hazeh, Lefia Smuchin Aruin Lahem, Kamoshe Darshu Rabbeinu. And Moshe Rabbeinu then wrote the entire Torah in its entirety. At the end of the 40th year, we receive the Torah in the form it is now. It is completed. It is written down to its full extent. Now, Rashi is following this idea of Ein Mukdam Muchar b'Torah, and thus the Parshot are arranged thematically. Yes, most of it is chronological in order as well. Events are occurring in order. Though Rashi finds that there are certain times when Parshot and certain Parshot and Torah are aligned in a certain order to convey certain themes that have to be expressed in this thematic manner. Now, Rashi believes for this reason that the Chet HaEgel causes the Mishkan to have to be built. And for that reason, Rashi understands that the Parsha to have been occurring in a reverse order. First comes Parsha Kitisa, where you have the command, where you have the sin of the building the Chet HaEgel, and only following that we have the building of the actual Mishkan and the commandment to build the Mishkan, Shurma Tetzaveh, and finally the completion of the building in V'yakom Pekude. Now, let's take one more look over here and try to see, because this is our Ramban shir. We're going to try and take a look at how the Ramban views this, and also the question we left off with last time. How could Rashi say this? This seems to be something that suggests that the building of the Mishkan is something that's b'diavad, something that is second nature, not the ideal choice. So perhaps we could suggest like this. There already is a precedent that Rabbi Leibtag points out in his article on OU Torah. I'll paste a link in the comments below. That Rabbi Leibtag points out that there is a concept of mikdash that exists already in the Torah earlier to this. We have Yaakov at Beit El, and we have the idea of a mikdash that's going to be built in the future. And we have this sort of idea of a holy place, an abode where God can rest. And we see this as well in Aziyashir, or mikdash Hashem konenu yadecha. This idea of a mikdash is something that is clearly on the forefront of our forefathers and something that is a reoccurring theme throughout the Torah. So the idea to have the Mishkan, Rashi could perhaps be explained that the Mishkan is only a temporary dwelling. Rashi perhaps could be understood that if Bnei Israel had not sinned the Chet Egel, they wouldn't have needed a Mishkan. They would have gone straight to Israel, perhaps, and built a Mikdash right then, the Beit HaMikdash, a permanent sanctuary for God. Now, when Bnei Israel, now that they sinned, Rashi understands they had to build a Mishkan in the Midbar, and they had to have this immediate sort of connection. That makes perfect sense. Thematically, it makes sense. Rashi explains for that reason the themes of the Parashiyot and Kitisa, the Chet Egel, caused the Mikdash to be built. But this Mikdash is a traveling Mikdash. It's a Mishkan, something that is given for this amount of time. And then eventually, while it still will be extremely holy and all of his vessels will maintain their Kedusha, the Beit HaMikdash ultimately will be the ultimate gathering this place of Kedusha. Now, we're going to end with this last minute here. How do we understand the Ramban then? Rashi makes a lot of sense for why the Mishkan is being built as a temporary dwelling place. Now, the Ramban seems to be understanding that the Mishkan is something that's, from first glance, it was a commandment that was given way before the Chet Egel. So there was some sort of ideal that the Mishkan would represent. Ramban, then we can understand what we read last week. Ramban, when he writes this, suggests that the Mikdash and the Mishkan itself is a place for Bnei Israel to connect immediately to God. And after having received the Torah in Har Sinai, they needed a way to be able to have a mediary, an intermediary perhaps, to relate directly to God. And the Mishkan supplied this need and supplied this idea for Bnei Israel to be able to connect to God immediately. The Ramban therefore notes that is why the Mikdash has to be built. The Mishkan has to be built right now. Yes, there will be a future Mishkan, a future Mikdash, though the Mishkan is something that is necessary in this moment for no other reason. So with that understanding, we can now go forward and understand better the Parashiyot and see more in this exactly fundamental debate between Ramban and Rashi. And there's much more to be said, though we can see clearly this idea of how we view the Mishkan, and it's not a Bidi Evid idea according to Rashi. The Mishkan is something that will play a fundamental role in our history in the past for the Jewish people, though also going forward, especially these ensuing Parashiyot where we develop ideas of Korbanot and Parashat Vayikra and on in the Sefer of Vayikra. So we will see that going forward. Have a great Shabbos, everyone. Enjoy.